Mark asked me, want to make any opening comments. I'll make a statement that I will likely regret, which I think this next section is less boiling the ocean. You know, when actually after the day yesterday, I did feel like the first session I was still feeling like we were sort of boiling the ocean and spinning around. I feel less so after the discussion we just had. I think we made some good progress. I think we might be farther along in this second one, and my statement that I'll probably regret is it may not take as long to talk about these things.
Well, I can tell you it's not going to take as long because we are going to get to the third session too, and not run out of time. So that's not optimism. That's well-founded belief. But hopefully Greg's comment is also right that there is maybe a bit more of a consensus or on a relatively less complex set of issues. But we do want to hear from you about this topic as well. So Greg gave an overview of what we heard yesterday, and just like in the last session, would like to hear additional perspectives, insights, things that we ought to consider as we move in the direction of, again, if not a checklist, at least a set of key issues to identify, principles, and steps to move forward in some opportune cases in the area of treatment, in the area of real-world treatment and treatment heterogeneity. Is there consensus on this one? Yeah.
I'll just ask Kathy Critchlow, Amgen. I'll just ask a question. So I always like it's interesting when we talk about checklists. Are we talking about sort of minimum criteria, or that they'll be sufficient? I mean, the thing about checklists is everybody thinks that you check those off and you're done, but I'm assuming that's not the case.
Yeah, maybe checklist is the wrong term, because to use one of these examples, use an example from here. I thought yesterday was a pretty useful discussion about the question of blinding. So I think what we'd want to talk about is, in, say, a pragmatic trial, who should be blinded and why? And, my list, at least at this point, my working list would include 4 categories. Should the analyst be blinded? Yes. I think the answer to that one is yes. It's hard for me to come up with a circumstance where that would not be true. Should those who are ascertaining outcomes be blinded? Almost always yes. Could you potentially come up with a good reason why not? I guess so. Come up with what's your reason? Should the providers delivering the treatments be blinded? Maybe. Here are the reasons why that might be a good idea. Here are the reasons why that might be a bad idea. Which reasons apply to your situation? Should the patients receiving the treatment be blinded to which treatment they're getting? Maybe. Here are the reasons. So that's what I'm imagining we would produce, and it would really say, if you are making a decision about blinding, which is a key decision about treatment delivery, you're actually making, I don't want to say I have the final list, but those would be my 4. There are 4 decisions you're making. For each of those 4 decisions, here are the criteria you should use to make that decision. Does that make sense? That's what I'm talking about in terms of a checklist. That's where we'd like to get. What that means is, that this is a pet peeve of mine. When people say double blind, I say, which 2 of the 4? Because there are 4 actors, there are not 2.
Actually, when they say that, they mean the caregiver and the patient.
Yeah.
They assume the others. Yeah.
We don't have new comments online yet, but I'll try to do a better job keeping track.
I just want to comment about the endpoint isn't subjective, and that's a very broad. I mean, what do we mean by subjective? Because although we all sort of think of things like how I feel is subjective, and those endpoints are changes, and I brought this up with Bob yesterday, the trial with the renal nerve denervation, I apologize, in which it was hypertension, and people might not think hypertension is very subjective, and yet there was a big difference when you blinded and did a sham procedure than the other randomized trials that did not do that. So I think we have to be very careful about declaring if it's subjective, then we blind, and if it's not, because it's hard to know what's subjective.
I think it does get into the details, but I think maybe in this sort of what is the checklist, I think what we would like to know is, have you thought through in what way could one of these actors' knowledge of treatment assignment influence the ascertainment or the classification of the outcome? So the sort of silly example we used yesterday, when we talked about, in the skit at the beginning, when the stone-faced federal bureaucrat asked the applicant, well, were all of the coroners who certified those deaths, trained in good clinical practice? I'll get a little, into the weeds here. If our outcome were all-cause mortality, I think we would probably say that the ascertainment of alive or dead is not likely to be influenced by knowledge of the treatment assignment. If, however, our outcome was cardiovascular mortality, it could. And it is possible that that coroner might even know what drug someone was taking before they died, and that might influence their likelihood. So that is, I'd say, I don't know if I'd put that as super high likelihood, but it's at least conceivable. So the outcome is subjective, may be the wrong term. It may be, what is the process by which knowledge of treatment assignment might influence ascertainment or classification? Is that highly likely, plausible but unlikely, impossible?
Well, I mean, you made the right distinction. If there's if you're trying to figure out cause of death, as opposed to whether they're dead or alive, it's very subjective. And there is a classic example and a paper written about it, about something called the anterior reinfarction trial, with a paper written in 1980 showing how whether you decided a person had sudden death or heart attack death or whatever was totally subjective and totally manipulated. It's a good paper. You should read it. Me and Gordon Pledger wrote it. It's in the New England Journal, still there.
Rick and then
I think when we look at this list about blinding, I want to add a little bit more. Having been the person who designed the sham renal denervation study, we did learn a lot from that. I think you always had to be skeptical that you need to blind whenever possible. And this was a hard lesson to learn, but most people feel that there's just an issue about placebo and Hawthorne effect. It's much more than that. What we discovered in the renal denervation study, which, just to let everybody know, there was a novel technique to reduce hypertension by interrupting the parasympathetic nerves between the kidney and the brainstem at the renal artery using RF energy, based on a lot of good science, by the way. The prospective single-arm study published in BMJ was wildly positive. Baseline reduction of 30 millimeters of mercury at follow-up 6 months. The open-label randomized controlled clinical trial published in Lancet was wildly positive, 30 millimeters of mercury reduction in the treatment arm. And that we then bought the company for a lot of money, and we did a sham study. We insisted we did the sham study, and it was dead neutral. I think there was a millimeter difference between the two arms. Now, what we found was that there was huge motivation on the patient's part, huge motivation on the assessor's part for this to be positive. The patients were told when they got randomized to placebo, and they knew it, that they should hang in there because if they still have hypertension, they'll get the therapy at the end. That's what they were told. So they intentionally didn't take medications on the day they were being measured because they wanted their blood pressure to be high so they could get the therapy for free later. Nobody ever thought about that kind of mechanism, right? The people who are taking blood pressures were...
People are sneaky, aren't they?
Yeah. The people taking blood pressures, we interviewed them, and we found that all these people wanted to be the hospital that discovered a new therapy for hypertension. Everybody in that hospital wanted this thing to work. So when the nurses were taking blood pressure and someone they knew got the therapy and they saw it was high, they said, well, sometimes I would just tell them, take a deep breath, relax a little bit. They would take it over until they finally got it lower. By the way, there's a literature on this that we didn't know about in the pharma where these things happen. But my view has been that when trying to make inference about anything that isn't completely objective, you should try to blind as whenever possible and utilize randomization. And I know that that goes against a lot of the feelings of the way people feel about observational research, but Hawthorne effect and placebo effect are really damaging effects that are based on lies You have to tell patients something works. That's why there's a belief system that's a false belief system. And what's interesting is that in the case of renal denervation, this was already approved in Europe. There was a huge practice of renal denervation being done, and everybody was reinforced by their own anecdotal experiences, very similar to what was seen in the placebo and Hawthorne effect in the clinical trial, until we finally realized that basically this didn't work. Final issue is that when we finally looked at this, there were still scientists that said, this should work. We re-examined our anatomy data, and we found out, in fact, that we were actually denervating in the wrong place. We repeated the study with the new data, and now it works. It was published last year, and we finally found it. We should have done that kind of analysis first before finding out later that it was wrong. But can you imagine that we would have this therapy that would be subjecting people to risk that wouldn't be effective, that would go everywhere because nobody did the blinded study? So again, I just think that when you think about this checklist, you have to be extremely creative with the notion that really bad things can happen in studies that are not blinded.
First of all, thanks for being willing to air the dirty laundry in public, because we can all learn from that. Some people bury their mistakes and no one learns anything. The question, I guess, is that word. What I think I'm hearing is that word objective doesn't cut it. In terms of saying, what really is that thing? I mean, what we're talking about is how in any way could that outcome be influenced by hopes, expectations, and so I'm not sure I'm not sure there's one word that captures it, but I think when we're coming up with whatever it is, a checklist, the question we need to ask is, what is any possible way that the assessment of this outcome, could be influenced? And I guess then say, have you nailed that down?
And are there ways to learn more about that? I mean, if you're doing a prospective, pragmatic trial, blinding may be possible. I think in a lot of the applications here, that's not going to be so feasible. And there are a lot of reasons to think that because patients got one particular treatment of interest, there may be other aspects of treatment that go along with it. The reasons you described, the fact that centers that are more likely to use certain treatments are probably more likely to do other things too. Getting back to really, are you comparing it to well, it's Hawthorne, but it's also Sebastian's form. You're really comparing clinical practice differences or a treatment difference in particular. And hopefully there are some ways from collecting additional data on treatments and the like that could help at least address whether these kinds of issues are there, if not address their magnitude. Now, Elise, you had a comment earlier?
Oh, well, I was also just going to comment on the placebo effect, so I think you said it well, but I don't know if anyone has seen the study that came out a few months ago where they gave people cream for itch or something, and they actually told them it was the same ingredient, but one was like an expensive drug in a fancy package, and one was they told them the price was lower and it was in a very plain package, and the people who got the plain package reported way more adverse events. So
Now, and I want to go back to, the discussion we had yesterday in this session about the sort of studies of the NOACs, and, comparing across studies is always problematic because a lot of things vary. But for instance, the rocket study was your sort of, I guess you could say quadruple blind, but in the traditional term, double blind, patients and providers blinded. The treatments were constrained to be identical, which means the people who got one of the new drugs still got their INRs measured, that everybody got, equal appearing pills, everything done, the sort of double dummy design to make everything appear. While I think it was the RELY study was open label. They yielded essentially the same findings, saying it didn't seem to make a big difference, although they were, different, same drug class, different products. And what Rob pointed out, I think, and I think he's probably got some inside information on this, was that double dummy design probably added $200 million, to the cost of the trial, and that's serious money. And the question is, what did it buy? Now, after the fact, we can look back and say, I didn't buy that much. But did we know that before the fact? So at what point, and maybe there's no definite answer to this, at what point in the life cycle would we say, If we're doing, maybe we need this really strict blinding when we're doing the 50-person trial, but when we're doing the literally 15,000-person trial and we look at the money and we say, how is it really worth it? Now, I'm not one of those people who has to come up with that money, but some of the people in this room, I guess, are some of the people who sometimes need to come up with that money. So I'd be curious what you think.
I don't think it's so simple as small trial, big trial, or big study, small study. So, for example, Exonitis, where the issue is small, single arm, historic comparator, and I think Dr. Jenkins was his criticism really the quality or the validity of the data, not necessarily the design or the comparison. So here was a clinical study where the question is whether or not the data are good quality, not necessarily the measurement, which was actually subjective. The issue is if there's a dramatic change and it's acute, you can have 10 people. For example, if you have something that's universally fatal in 3 months and then you introduce a drug and nobody dies and they're still alive 2 years later, you don't need a comparative arm.
But I think I was asking specifically about this question about the extra expense and work required to maintain blinding. And when is that worth it and when is it not? Maybe that doesn't have anything to do with the size of the trial.
But exactly, but it does apply. So the issue is what is your outcome? And how can it be gamed? It's really hard to game. We said death, right? They die or not, and that can be, it's not very subjective. And major bleeds, and hospitalization for major bleeds or a stroke. It's not very subjective. It's clear. When it becomes more subjective, then we have a lot of issues about the impact. And what you're saying is it wasn't necessarily blood pressure's a continuum. It was more subjective because it was the way they were measuring it was subjective of which measurement they were going to give you and how people were acting. So it changed the measurement. That's where you have a problem.
Yeah. So okay. So let me. What I'm trying to do is go beyond this subjective objective and trying to think. If we're trying to make some guidance, could we give even more explicit guidance? So on one end is dead or alive. On the other end maybe is blood pressure. Stability may be an important characteristic here. A state which is stable and a state which is unstable, like blood pressure, because a state which is unstable is more subject to manipulation. It can be measured multiple times and you can take the measure you want. While a hemorrhagic stroke is a fairly stable phenomenon, if you did that scan 4 times, you'd likely come up with the same result. A health state that leaves a sort of, I don't know what to call it, except an undeniable signal. Somebody can go back and look at that scan and say, was that a hemorrhagic stroke or not? Somebody can't go back and look at all those blood pressures that weren't written down, because it sounds like that's what happened. There were some blood pressures that people said, I'm not going to write that one down. On the other hand, if you've got a connected blood pressure meter, now of course people could still decide when to measure it. I suspect that could still be gamed. But the term is sort of pejorative. But if we tried to think about a way to go beyond the sort of calling it objective and say, because it's really not objective, it's really, I don't know how to say it except variability and potential gameability.
I think that. I think you can grow a body of knowledge to be smarter about how to make those decisions. I think you can blind inexpensively, especially assessor blindment. Blinding is not that expensive to do. Patient maybe a little bit more because you have to do some kind of sham procedure to some level. But I think, for example, if we look at the famous TASTE trial, this is a study that was a 6,000 patient randomized study done in Sweden. To look at the effectiveness of removing a blood clot in a coronary artery before putting a stent in. And it seemed like that was the right thing to do, right? Because if you put a stent in, there's fragments of clot that go downstream. Why not suck the clot out first before you put the stent in? It just makes a lot of sense. So nobody was going to do a randomized study. They decided to do it in Sweden, but they had a nice protocol in Sweden that everybody who got heart attacks had the same electronic health record system. So they just layered on randomization by approving a verbal randomization. I think Mike Lauer wrote a really nice editorial in New England Journal of Medicine. I think the cost is $50 a patient. For a 7,000 patient trial, it was like $350,000. And they came up with the answer, which was there was no value of removing the clot before the therapy. That was designed to be an objective outcome. What they looked at was they looked at the spread of the CPK, the cardiac enzyme. That was the endpoint. That's a laboratory measurement. It's going to be really hard to think about how you could influence that by placebo and Hawthorne effect. And so it was an accepted measure of the damage of myocardial infarction, which was the endpoint. And they showed that, in fact, the means were almost identical. So in that situation, you could say, okay, I've got the checkbox. This is an extremely objective endpoint defined by itself as an objective laboratory endpoint that people will accept. The blinding was not really critical. It was just about randomization, which was critical, and it was layered on top of a very simple way to do it. And I think that when we do blood pressure now, we'll know but smarter that actually you have to pay attention to this. We used to think it was objective, but it actually isn't. And I think that there might be a growing body to say, here's a list of endpoints. Be careful about these. Don't worry so much about these, and that might be a way to guide.
I do think this is a good discussion, but it's starting to sound a little more complicated again. I think because we're getting back to data issues, and then going to move. So this is something we need to handle, and maybe in thinking about it, does it go?
But I think
this part of the report.
I think this is good. I mean, I think we're at the point of saying we don't just want to use that word objective. We need some more specifics. We can work on some more on this.
Yeah, and in terms of measures of outcomes and data used to create measures of outcomes, I do want to make sure before we leave this section that people don't have more to say about issues related to treatment heterogeneity and kind of where we started on this, where prospective treatment assignment for the treatment you're interested in may actually be correlated with a number of other harder to measure aspects of treatment differing, not just impacts on data and measures of outcomes too. Yeah.
So one sort of point I just want to make somewhere is that, just because it's a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean that the population isn't biased. So people are treated in the real world. And so like one example is the drug aprotinin, where there were like dozens of studies that showed a benefit, but they were in low-risk patients. But the drug was used in high-risk patients in the real world, and it actually eventually got pulled from the market because it was causing more harm than benefit. So, drugs and medical procedures are used in the real world. So we want to know how they act in the real world. And just another point while I have the mic, what you were saying about before about the probabilistic myocardial infarction, right? Like, I mean, we have to really talk about what outcomes do patients care about, right? So a probability of a 0.4 probability of having a heart attack that's subclinical, maybe the patient doesn't care about that, right? The patient is going to care about their function and their, so even in the case of renal denervation, we don't actually really know if hypertension, even if renal denervation did reduce hypertension, if that mechanism is the same as what drugs do, and that will ultimately reduce strokes and other bad things. So, so I think we have to keep the eye on the ball of what are the outcomes that matter to patients and how can we measure them.
Getting to, as Mark said, talking about this heterogeneity of treatment, one thing I think I heard yesterday, but want to put this out there because if we're trying to talk about some guidance, the question about, if the state of nature or the comparator is a treatment that's currently being applied, but highly variable in quality, there's a lot of variation. What I think I heard was a general idea that when you're picking your setting, well, let's use the warfarin NOACs example. What we'd say is, if we're picking our care settings or designing our study protocol, what we'd like to do is to say, can we say that the warfarin treatment is being delivered at least better than average? Not to say the warfarin treatment has to be delivered perfectly, because perfect is not possible. But certainly we wouldn't want to say, let's intentionally seek out settings where warfarin treatment is delivered so poorly that it's not realistic either. Especially if we're designing a protocol where we have some control over the quality of that treatment, there's probably an ethical obligation to say, let's not assign people to a lousy treatment that we know won't work. Let's try to do at least better than people would get out, in the real world on average. So I'm putting out there that better than average principle. That should be a standard in terms of selection of treatment setting and in terms of the design and tightness of the study protocol, even in a real world trial. real world, we might say, oh, we should let it be whatever it is, but we probably want to set some floor under that. But curious what people think about that.
Well, just to add to that, if you're thinking about real world, then maybe it's people who fail or are unable to maintain warfarin within the range that are going to go on those other drugs. So that's actually a very important question. People that can't be stabilized, or are they better treated? So the issue is the more you make your criteria for your real world trial to stringent to then look like a clinical trial for efficacy that we have today, the fewer questions you answer. So you got to think about this.
Yeah, no, good point. And maybe I'd want to distinguish when we're making a checklist to talk about the difference between bad treatment and people who had bad outcomes. There may well be people who have bad outcomes with reasonable treatment, and they may be of high interest because they are the people most likely to benefit. But I think there's a distinction between those who had bad outcomes and those who got really bad treatment.
Well, all of the questions are interesting. Remember, the NOAC trials were all designed as non-inferiority studies, and that was to show that these new treatments had an effect. So to do that, you had to figure out what your non-inferiority margin was, which was huge because warfarin's very effective. And you probably wanted warfarin to be reasonably well used to know that these drugs still had an effect. That doesn't mean that's the only question. It's very interesting to know whether in a real-world environment people don't use warfarin very well. And that could very well be another trial that could be done without insisting that people follow the things very clearly. And then we love studies in non-responders to other therapy. People hardly ever do them. Because you have to randomize back to the drug that was failed. Because the fact that you failed in real life doesn't mean you're going to fail in the new trial. So I'm aware of exactly 4 studies that have ever been done of that kind. It's how clozapine got approved. It's how a drug called Bepredil got approved, even though it kills you with QT prolongation. And it's how Vioxx failed to beat Celebrex. When Celebrex non-responders were randomized back to Vioxx or Celebrex, there was no difference at all. I would have expected there would be one, but those are the only 4 trials that ever did that I know.
Am I hearing in there the idea that if we're in a non-inferiority design, we would want to set a higher bar for the quality of the comparator treatment?
Well, the main thing you have to know in a non-inferiority design is how the control drug worked in this setting. I just find it hard to imagine that you could ever know what the effect in real-world setting, in a clinic, for almost any drug is. Unless the effect is enormous, maybe for Coumadin you could make a good guess because the reduction in event rate is 60%. But it's very hard for me to imagine a non-inferiority study in this setting because I don't know how you're going to calculate what your margin is because that's not where you did the study. It's completely different. Very big problem. So you have to win.
And just one other comment. I think the other thing about the real world is it's not static. So I think that when we're talking about deciding, even for the warfarin studies versus the NOACs, the DOACs, that setting the comparator in terms of slightly a better than average in terms of within therapeutic range, that might be reasonable because when we're developing these anticoagulation clinics and we're getting better about monitoring warfarin, it may be better in 5 years about attaining 70% within therapeutic range on warfarin. And so that it's probably important to look at slightly better than what it is because it might be going there soon. And so that we kind of incorporate that into the thinking of the real world changes pretty rapidly. Well, I don't know if it changes rapidly, but it changes.
Yeah, and the point as I'm fond of saying, generalizability is a question about the future. Generalizability is not a question about the past or even the present. It's about the future because it's what is the setting to which we will generalize these results for a future decision. As Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So that's the challenge. But when we're setting this, what's the bar for how good the usual care or the current comparator is? We would ideally like to say, what will it look like in 3 years, 5 years? How will this current treatment be delivered at that point? And if we see trends, so this might be another thing that those who would be establishing a usual care comparator should be obligated to do, to say, have you looked at the variability across settings and what's happening now? Have you looked at the time trends for that, and is that changing?
Just a question to put up for future for consideration here and going forward relative to your comments there. How are we planning, piloting, and validating the use of artificial intelligence across our agencies and businesses relative to your point on the future decision making?
Thanks. But, Mark's saying, and I think he's right, that we probably need to move on pretty soon. And I think there hasn't been as much new stuff coming out in this topic. I don't know if that is the truth or if I caused that negative placebo effect by predicting it. And we were not blinded, so we will never know.
I think it's there, although just picking up on Bob's comment, these questions about the difference in treatment effects that are observed in trials versus those that are likely to be observed in the real world are substantial and meaningful, and highlight, again, the value of trying to find a path forward here. They're not necessarily going to be the same or even close to the same, I think.
So I guess sort of last call on this area. I think we're farther along on this one before we move on to talk about, randomization, which is, of course, an eternal debate that we will try to contain to 45 minutes.
Yeah, great. So maybe another placebo effect, or maybe another intervention effect. But
no, I guess maybe I just jinxed it by saying it's an eternal debate. Yeah.